So how have
Years
you
ago,
been? How did your Rafael Mendez conference go and all that?
it was really good. It's one of our best ones yet.
Cool.
38
Oh,
years in a row. Yeah.
wow. I've always wanted to go to that. And I think that's also you're responsible for Summit Records and all of that too, right?
Yeah, I formed Summit Brass first. That was in 1985. We had our first big institute, which was then at the Keystone Resort up in the mountains of Colorado. And we called it the Keystone Brass Institute. And then a couple years later, we formed Summit Records. We had been recording for another label, and they weren't paying royalties. They weren't, they were not letting us play the repertoire we wanted to do and this and that. So we finally just said, to heck with that. We started our own label, and it just grew from there. So it's a pretty decent little label going now. I don't own it anymore, um, but I'm still kind of associated with it.
Yeah.
But then in 1993, it was renamed the Rafael Mendez Brass Institute. I had known the Mendez family for a long time, and I knew Rafael a little bit. And then in '93, we established the Rafael Mendez Library at Arizona State University, where I was teaching. And I said, why don't we name the institute after your father? Because we had left Keystone by then. And it moved around the country. We went to Tempe, Arizona. Then we went to Bloomington, Indiana for a year, Long Beach, California for a year, Cincinnati for I think 5 or 6 years, then Boulder, Colorado for a couple of years, and then moved to Denver. And it's been in Denver now for 20 years. So it seems like we've found a good place to keep it there, the University of Denver.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that's well, I remember I remember hearing about it a long time ago, and I think one of the things that really got me most interested was when you guys reissued the Rafael Mendez recordings, because I guess we can consider we've officially started this interview. But I'm 55, and I remember being in the library at my high school, and I heard about Rafael Mendez, and my library had one recording of him, so I got it, but I couldn't find any of the other ones. And maybe I found one or two when I went to college down in Los Angeles. But when you reissued them, I bought the whole set of 12. So you did
yeah,
that, and then that cool interview that I'm imagining it was your project where it had all these different players like Doc and
yeah,
yeah, Malcolm McNabb and everyone sharing stories
yeah.
about Mendez. And that I remember in Bakersfield they had a music store that doesn't exist anymore, and they had that Rafael Mendez, like I think it was maybe like a 45 or a 78 that had him playing the tonguing exercise things out of Arbin. I remember I bought that. It was like anything that I could find with Rafael Mendez, I would buy.
Yeah. Yeah, Carl Fisher released an LP, 12-inch LP, the single tongue studies. And yeah, I bought that when I was in high school. It's a funny thing because I was surprised that even though Mendez's tonguing on that Arbin thing was so clean, um, I was surprised he didn't play the exercises faster because they seemed to me to be a reasonably moderate to fast tempo. I could do that. That speed
Yeah.
I could be going faster. Well, I found out later after I got to know Raphael and his sons quite well. Now his grandchildren I know quite well. Um, Raphael's nemesis was single tonguing. When he was a little boy, he had a terrible time with it. He couldn't go faster than like ta 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 ta. That was about it. And he's just everything else was developing, but the single tongue was so slow. So his father, who was his teacher, his father was a band leader there in their little village in Iquilpan, Michoacan, in Mexico. And father, whose main instrument was mandolin, taught all the kids to play instrument. They had a family orchestra, which is how they made a living. And he taught Raphael to double tongue. So Raphael practiced that incessantly fact, his nickname was Tuku because he would walk around town saying the syllables over and over to himself. And he developed that at such an early age that he would just play a typical Sousa march or anything, all double tongued. And it finally became so easy for him and natural that he developed into his fantastic technique. But he still only used single tongue for slow things. And his contract with the Carl Fisher Company was to publish quite a few of his solos, several of his trios, and to write a book, which was that Prelude to Brass Playing, and that's a whole nother story.
Because right, I remember we talked about that.
Yeah, he didn't write the book, but he kind of helped edit it. But also to record those Arvin single tongue studies, and he kept putting that record off. So it was, the last record he made was that Arvin thing, and
so that came after his other 12 albums.
Well, actually, maybe not. I think there was maybe one or two of his very last albums that he made in the early 70s or late 60s. But the Mendez Plays Arvin book came out around 66 or something like that, 67 maybe. But he was so proud of that record that whenever people would come over to his house, sometimes people would visit him and they would say, well, we've heard you, on the radio, and but I don't have any recordings. They're all out of print. And would you play one of your recordings for us? This really nice, elaborate stereo system at home. So he'd say, okay. And he would go over to his shelf of records and pull out the Mendez Plays Arvin. That for him. And of course, they're looking at each other like, what's the big deal with this? But he's, oh, hear that. He was so proud that he actually single-tongued it and, made himself do it. And
well, it's really funny because I wonder, I think I'd heard that he did this. Part of our talk, we were going to talk about Claude Gordon, but I remember Claude mentioning he'd played with Rafael and that he said that he couldn't single tongue really fast. And he also said that Rafael really never could triple tongue, that he would double tongue I don't know if this is correct, where he double tongue the triplets going like tika 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 and just
yeah. No, he actually could triple tongue quite well, but he didn't like to do it. He only recorded a long string of triple tonguing in the Hoda number 1.
Okay.
He composed 3 Hotas. Hoda number 1 has like a whole page of triple tongue, and he triple tongues the TTK. But he said that triple tonguing was kind of associated with the old cornet players and their solos, and he didn't want to get that stigma, so he preferred the double tonguing, but he could triple tongue, and I think that's why he recorded that one solo with triple tonguing to show he could do it. But he was good at it. He just didn't want to be like the old guys.
Do you know if he did, like, one of the things that Claude Gordon used to have, like one of the reel-to-reels where you could switch it into half speed, and I think several people did this where they took the Mendez recordings and put them at half speed, and you could still hear how clean Mendez's tonguing was.
That's right.
Do you know if Mendez did that himself when he would practice or analyze his practicing?
I'm sure he did. Back in his time, and certainly when I was growing up, the LP record players had settings where you could go 78 RPM, 33 and a third RPM, or 16.
I remember, like 16 and a half. I had one that did that. Yeah.
Yeah. And when you put it on the slow, you could hear like down an octave, half speed.
Right.
And you could really hear how clean he played. But Rafael owned his own 15 IPS, 15 inch per second reel-to-reel tape recorder. And he could do multi-tracks on it. He could do, as many as 8 tracks on it.
Wow.
So whenever one of his grandchildren had a birthday, he would compose a little tune for them. And then he would overdub himself playing piano, guitar, trumpet, clarinet, sometimes euphonium.
Wow.
Horn, and he would sing. So he could play a number of instruments a little bit.
Are those recordings, did those exist?
he'd make a little reel-to-reel tape for them and give that to them as a birthday present.
So does anyone have those? Have you ever put those out?
So that we've looked for them, and in the Mendez library we have some sketches where he wrote out a little tune and has words, and then but the actual recordings, I think, probably only had the one tape that he gave to them, and none of them can find them now, probably because they don't have machines to play them on. But it was recently that the Mendez family notified me, asked me if I could find one of those tapes in the library, and I said we don't have any of those birthday tunes. A lot of tapes of Rafael practicing and live broadcasts from the radio and this and that he had on tape, but not the birthday tunes. But he would record himself with this tape recorder, and he would practice for as many as 7 or 8 hours a day, playing the same lick over and over. It might be like an 8-bar phrase that was difficult, technical thing. He'd get up in the morning in his pajamas, go down the end of the house where his studio was, turn on the recorder, and there was a big stack of these 15 IPS tapes in these boxes, and nothing written on the boxes. Sometimes his name was written on them, but didn't say what it was. So I was doing some work at a studio here in Tempe one time, and I took a couple of those tapes over there, and I said, would you put these on? I want to hear what's on them. And so they all were like this. You'd hear him kind of fudging around the room and warming up a little bit, and then you'd hear him play like this impossibly fast 8-bar phrase, and it would sound perfect. Then there'd be about a 10-second delay. He's kind of coughing and try it again. He'd play it again. Then a little rest and play it again, over and over and over and over and over. And so we fast forward the tape, like what would be like 15 minutes, play, same thing, 15 minutes, same thing. Go 2 hours into the tape, same thing. And his wife used to go crazy hearing the same thing all day long. So sometimes at lunchtime, she'd make him a sandwich, and she'd go into his studio, and as soon as he stopped playing, put the horn down, she'd stick a sandwich in his mouth. And sometimes late in the afternoon, she'd get mad at him, saying, why do you keep playing that same thing over and over? It's driving me crazy. And he would say, because I still have to think about it. And he said, I know I play it perfectly every time, but I still have to kind of think about what my fingers are doing or something about it. And I want it to just be like saying 1, 2, 3. You don't think about it, you just do it. And I think that's what gave him his incredible consistency and accuracy, but also listening to a lot of the recordings that we have in the library. He played with hundreds of high school bands, some of them quite good, but a lot of them not very good. And so you'd hear him playing, and the band would be completely falling apart. They're not together, they're horribly out of tune. And he's still playing. He'd sound just like on his Decca records. And I think that there were so many distractions because of the band that if he didn't really have it down pat, it would throw him off. So he got to where he just had it that well ingrained.
Wow.
And, I used to think when I was student practicing, if I could play it 30 times in a row perfectly, I own it. And that's kind of what I went by. But then I listened to him, he'd do it hundreds of times. And then I always wondered, why did Rafael play better than I ever did? Now I know he practiced harder. And Rafael often said in interviews, people would say, well, people say you were a musical genius and blah, blah, blah. And he said, well, I don't think so. I was mostly self-taught, although my early lessons were with my father. And he never really had any what you call trumpet lessons with anybody to speak of. But he said, I taught myself, he only had a 3rd grade education. He taught himself theory. In fact, we have all this little theory notebooks that he would fill out the exercises that he did when he was a kid. And then he taught himself to compose, and I think he was a pretty good composer and arranger, and published a lot of these pieces. And then, but he said, I don't consider myself a genius. I just think I practice harder than anybody I've ever known. And I have to agree with that. I know people that practice many hours, but not as diligently as he did. And so I think that was his secret, was just practice till, till it's just ingrained, and it's never gonna go away.
Yeah, and there was a quote with Claude Gordon that I heard of him saying to several people, that it's like the difference between a good player and a virtuoso is that the good player plays until he doesn't make a mistake, and the virtuoso plays until he can't make a mistake.
Oh, there you go.
And I think there's a huge difference between people like Rafael Mendez, which we'd obviously consider a virtuoso, and
Yeah.
other people that just play to the point to where they stop missing something. But it's like, I think Doc practiced like that too, right?
Right, right.
There's
Yeah,
like, even with Doc being in his 90s, the thing that kind of cracks me up is you see him. I mean, he wasn't here last time at ITG, but you see him walking around. He can't stop playing the trumpet.
no,
He's like in his 90s and obsessed with
especially if
playing
there's a
them.
stairwell, he's going to be in the stairwell because he said he could hear his sound better that way. You
Yeah,
know, but he practiced probably just as much as Mendez did, and probably, I mean, he was an equal virtuoso in a lot of ways. I mean,
yeah,
incredible players off the scale.
yeah.
Yeah,
Well, I think my thing is all about. I think that I want people to get excited about using method books and practicing. And I mean, we all know that it's all about that. That, I mean, you can buy a new horn, a new mouthpiece, but if you're not practicing the right
yeah,
way, it's not going to do that much, you know.
yeah.
Um, so like when we were talking at ITG, you were telling me about your experience with the Claude Gordon book, because you said some stuff to me. I'll just let you say it in your own words, but I just recently did an interview with Frank Catarabic, and I want to track this down. He said that he was doing a, a like a recital with some cornet solos at it when Claude was speaking in Arizona at that time. I don't know if you were there at that event. I want to try to find a recording of that with Frank, because
That was in 1979, the ITG. I was president of ITG back then. I remember that very well. Um, I don't think they recorded any of the sessions.
they did. I've actually it's on reel to reel, and there's a guy that I think he's moved from the university, but I think the archive of all those are on reel to reel at Columbus University in Columbus, Georgia.
And the ITG archives would have it then, yeah.
Yeah, so I want to track down. I paid to get the Claude Gordon one transferred to digital, but I wanted, and also paid to have that done with the Armando Gatala ones for his recital that I posted up online. But I wanted to find the one with Frank Catarabic because it kind of dovetails into this interview that I did with Frank recently. But
Yeah,
so
well, I heard Frank's recital. It was amazing.
yeah, that'd be cool to hear it, to get a recording of that so other people can hear it. I'd like to get all the ITG recordings digitized and maybe try to organize some people doing that, because those tapes will go bad after a while. They'll start to degrade and you can't even salvage them.
Yeah.
But so tell me, like, how did you meet Claude? If it was before that, how did you start doing the Claude Gordon books and related books, and what did it do in your playing? Because you shared some of that with me, but just share your story with that, because I know you're into brass pedagogy and know all the different method books and everything too.
Well, I first heard about Claude Gordon's systematic approach book when I was in high school, and the book came out in 1965, and I heard about it a year later, and I had attended a music camp in Lincoln, Nebraska. It was a 3-week summer music camp, and Denny Schneider was trumpet teacher there back then. He and I became friends for life. But Denny was telling me about this book, and that, pedal tones. And I'd never heard of pedal tones. I didn't know what they were. But he told me I should get this book. So there was a local music store there in Lincoln carrying the book because he wanted to have it on hand for all of his students. I went down and bought it. It was $20 book, which is a lot of money back then. And here it
Yeah.
is. Claude's original hand manuscript
That's
copy.
awesome. Yeah.
And it's kind of falling apart because I worked this book to death. So I got the book and took it home with me. And, Denny never gave me a lesson on pedal tones. He just told me I should get that book because I had a pretty weak embouchure. I could play quite well for my age, technically. My range was pretty good, but the high notes were kind of squeaky. They were kind of non-usable. But I could play up to high F or something, but just if I were playing in an ensemble, you wouldn't hear it. It's too thin.
Yeah.
But I thought, well, this book's what I need. So I took it and I was learning it on my own. And, I think pedal tones, usually you need a teacher. So I started trying to play into the pedal tones and I was playing the notes, but I was not using the correct embouchure for me. So I was just kind of letting everything go loose and, it felt good and the low notes came out, but as far as developing the embouchure, got zero good out of it. So I worked the book for a few weeks, 4 or 5 weeks, and saw absolutely no improvement in my sound, my endurance, my range, nothing. So I kind of gave up on it. Well, as I grew up in a little small town, Nebraska, and I used to go to nearby cities, Denver or Cheyenne, Wyoming, or wherever, if there was a big band touring like Stan Kenton Band or Woody Herman or anything like that. And I'd talk to the trumpet players and I'd listen and sometimes Severinsen would play with high school bands in my area or even Mendez, where I first met Mendez. But I'd always try to pick their brains at the clinic and after the concerts, that kind of thing. And whenever I talked to a lot of the lead players, well, sometimes the entire section of one of these big name bands, I would say, wow, all you guys are incredible, incredible range and endurance, and you never seem to get tired. 2-hour concert, you're still blowing strong. And how'd you do that? And they all recommended the Claude Gordon book.
Really?
And, now and then 1 or 2 of them had studied with Claude. And so I thought, okay, there's that book again. I got to practice that book. So I go back to the book. I spent weeks on it and got nowhere. So again, I'm thinking this book is not for me. I don't know why I don't get anything out of this book. Well, I did that kind of process several times through high school, and I kind of given up on the book, thinking it's not going to work. So I got a scholarship to go to the University of Colorado because I'd gone to their summer music camp 3 times and liked the university. So I went there, and as a freshman, I was playing first chair in all the ensembles, and thought I was kind of a big gun. And that's true. I could play really great for a 5-minute, 10-minute audition. But for a full concert, I'm having trouble getting through a 2-hour rehearsal, let alone a concert. And then all the older students were playing recitals. So I thought, well, I got to play a recital too. So I asked my teacher, can I play a recital? He said, well, I'm not sure your embouchure's ready for that. Why don't we do a half recital? You'll split it with a sophomore trumpet player, and you can alternate. So you're playing and resting, playing, resting. I said, great. Well, my first solo was the Brandt concert piece number 1, which I had played in high school contests and got a 1+ at contest and thought I played it real well. And then the other kid played a solo. Then I came out and played my second solo. I don't remember what it was now, but it went okay, but I was starting to get tired. And then the other guy played a piece. Then I came out and played my third solo, and I'm caving in. Halfway through, I can hardly play. I mean, I'm dying on the vine, and I just kind of limped to the end of the piece. Then the other guy played a solo. Then we ended with a duet, which turned out, in retrospect, I look back at this duet, which was a transcription of a piece by Frescobaldi for 2 violins or 2 oboes.
Oh,
Had
wow.
absolutely no rest in it. And so
Yeah.
even though it wasn't real high or anything, my chops said the endurance was gone. And so halfway through, I'm putting the horn down and just not playing. And the other guy would play, and then he'd stop and look at me, and the pianist would kind of freeze and then go on. And every time I put up the horn and tried to play, nothing would come out.
Oh, no.
And I just totally destroyed that whole concert. I mean, my chops, I knew I got a big problem. I got to get this fixed. And the trumpet teacher I had at the university, Frank Baird, really, he wasn't familiar with the pedal tone methods. It never really messed with them. He didn't really have any suggestions. He kept saying, well, just keep practicing. We'll hope someday it fixes itself. I had been hearing that from my regular high school teacher all through high school. So I called Denny Schneider and in Lincoln, and I said, I told him about the recital and said, I got to fix this. And he said, well, have you been doing that Claude Gordon book? I said, yeah, but I get nowhere. I do it for a month or so, and I see no progress. I give up on it. I've done that several times. And he said, well, you're not playing the pedals correctly. Because if you're doing them correctly, you're going to see progress every week. He said, now in Boulder, Denver area, there's got to be somebody that knows how to play pedals. Ask around, find out who can do it. Well, I asked around and nobody seemed to know, but I got lucky. The Denver Art Museum was opening, and it was going to be a big deal with the governor cutting the ribbon and the whole thing. The TV crews were there, big news thing. And they had hired a composer to write a fanfare for 15 trumpets. And I got a call to be one of the 15 come down and play it. Well, I showed up at the art museum, and we had a room where we were going to warm up and then have a little short rehearsal and then go out and play this fanfare. And so all the guys were older than me. Most of them were local pros around Denver. I was the only student. And, so I got to meet some of the names that I had heard about. One of them was Ed Linacek, who had been principal in the Denver Symphony for quite a few years, and I retired from the orchestra and was teaching public school and was a well-known trumpet teacher. And we're warming up, and just everybody's milling around the room, and he happened to turn, and I turned, and we were facing each other maybe 5 feet apart. And he plays his arpeggio, doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo, and this pedal C just roared out sound like a bass trombone. And I had never heard a pedal C played like that. My pedal C sounded weak and flabby and terrible, And this sounded like a huge, big trumpet note. I couldn't believe it. My eyes and ears got huge, and I said, "Is that a pedal C?" And he said, "Yeah, so what?" I said, "Would you do that again?" So, this pedal C roared out, and man, I took it in like a tape recorder. So as soon as I got back to school, I found a practice room. I got in front of a mirror, and I noticed that his embouchure looked different than mine. I tried to look like he was doing. I tried to sound like that. And I messed around with a C arpeggio trying to get down to pedal C, because I couldn't play a pedal C open. I had to do it 1, 2, and 3. And everyone said, you should do it open, but I couldn't do it. So I kept messing with it. And then after about 15 minutes, just for a split second, the pedal C came out and sounded just a little bit like him. I thought, wait a minute, I'm on to something. So I kept doing it. Another 15 minutes later, I'm playing pedal C open like a bass trombone. I was so excited. I walked around to every practice room. There'd be some violin player I didn't even know. I'd knock on the door, open the door, and say, "Listen to this." Whop. I was totally insane. And I go to the next practice room. I had to show everybody I can play pedal C. So then I got the book, I started over from the beginning and did it. And man, did it work. Every week I saw major endurance improvement. My range wasn't going higher yet, but those squeaks started to become usable notes. And after a couple of months, I can play a high F. I mean, it's actually, I could put it on the end of a solo and it was there.
Yeah.
And it just, everything got strong. So then I did the whole book. And then when I finished, I did the book again. And I started teaching it to everybody I knew. And that book was so important to me. So fast forward now, I go to grad school, Wichita State University, and then I start teaching at the University of Illinois. I taught there for 8 years, 74 to 82. And we had Claude Gordon in as a clinician. I think he was there 3 days. And he flew his own plane from California to Urbana.
Cool.
And then he's Ben's company paid for the whole thing.
Yeah.
And he gave a 2-hour clinic, which I do have on tape, which
I would love to get a copy.
I digitized to a CD, so I could probably.
I would love to get a copy of that.
Yeah, I'll get you a copy of that.
Cool.
You can hear him talk pretty well, and he demonstrates, and uh, so it's a good thing. But it's word for word the same clinic that he gave at ASU and ITG happened that you're talking about earlier, and
Yeah.
I'd seen him give that same clinic several other times, word for word the same. He had it memorized and down. And the only thing was at the end, he asked people would ask questions, so that was more improvisatory. But anyways, when he was coming to campus, yeah, sitting on my piano, I had this book sitting there just like this. And as soon as he walked in the door, he said hello, shook my hand, and walked straight to that book. And he said, "Oh, you have one of the original books. I have students that'll pay big money for this. I'll give you $200 for it right now."
Wow.
And I said, if it was any other book, I'd just give it to you, but not that book. That book saved my life because without my chops getting corrected, I would have gone nowhere. And I was majoring in trumpet performance, so I mean, it was a really important thing for me. And I said, to me, it's the most important book I've ever worked out of. And, and I've yet to find anyone that plays pedal tones correctly that doesn't swear by them. That doesn't mean that there aren't other methods that work fine. I've had a lot of students that did, long tones or this or that. If it's working, great. Doc Severinsen, he doesn't play pedal tones. In fact, in my pedagogy book, I have some pictures of him, and one of the pictures was to have each player play pedal C. And he looked at me and said, I don't play pedal C. And I said, well, sure, you can do it. So he did one, and it didn't sound like it was very good. But I took his picture. But, he's got great chops. He just didn't use the book. So there are many roads to Rome, as they say. But I think it's definitely one of the things that everybody should learn how to do, whether it's your main method for developing your own chops, but even in your own teaching, you're going to find that it works for a lot of people. And so my philosophy with teaching is exactly like my philosophy of the trumpet pedagogy book. Pedagogy meaning the study of methods of learning something. There's no one way that's going to work for everybody. So I always start with what I think they will benefit most from, and maybe it's what I do too, maybe not. We work that, and after a couple of weeks they're not getting anywhere, I say, okay, let's try plan B. We'll go to something completely different. Sometimes we go to plan C, plan D, sometimes even to things that don't work for me at all. I mean, for instance, long tones. A lot of people love long tones. I do them in very limited amounts. For me, they make me feel stiff. I like the moving long tones, as Clark studies, long breath things with subtle motion to keep it pliable. That works for me. Straight long tones like the Crusoe method does not. But there's so many people that it works for. You can't discount that. It's just one of the tools in our toolbox. And so sometimes I find that what works for somebody else, whether it be the method book or the mouthpiece that they're playing, whatever, works great for someone else and doesn't work for me or player X, Y, or Z at all. So there's no one way, but I find that the Claude Gordon is what worked for me the best. And I find that even if you're teaching, even if it's not your main method, you need to know how to do it. You need to know why it's good. You need to learn how to play pedal tones correctly. And because you're going to have a lot of students that are going to find that's the best one for them. So it'll be around a long time. Of course, pedal tones go back hundreds of years, back to the Baroque era. They used them back then as embouchure strengthening exercises. But that's how I got familiar with the book. And when Claude was there that whole 3 days, he gave a private lesson to every one of my students, like 30 minutes each. And they talked about pedal tones. He made sure that they were doing them correctly. And I had a lot of my students working the pedals already. And then I asked him if I could play for him, and so I played for him, and he thought my pedals were good and everything. So I felt validated because even though I had never had a formal, lesson with him, I was appreciative that he thought I was playing them correctly, and from watching his clinics, I could tell I was doing them very similarly to the way he was demonstrating. So that's how it helped me. And like I say, it's my number one book.
That's awesome. Well, there was a friend of mine that he was 6 years older than me, and he was kind of like a big brother. He was another Claude Gordon student. His name was Rich Hoffman. And when I was in high school, we carpooled together up to Northern California, and he just graduated Duke. And he told me that he was interviewing for grad schools. You might not remember him or whatever, but I think he auditioned for Florida State. He auditioned for Juilliard, and I think he went to audition for you. And you said to him, you need to work on fundamentals. I would put you in a practice room for a year working on Claude Gordon lessons. Why don't you just go take lessons with him? So he actually packed his things up, moved from New Jersey to Los Angeles, and took lessons with Claude because of what you said. And his playing completely was changed. And he became a really great player. I think he's still in Los Angeles doing stuff, but it changed his playing too. And we were talking about that as we are riding in the car, because the way I think about the pedals, and maybe you can tell me if you feel this, is pedals and doing all the flexibility and the things that kind of go along with this systematic approach book gets people to play in a more kind of relaxed, limbered up way of approaching instead of everything being stiff. I feel everything is more relaxed and free. So I kind of look at it as like that allows you to play easier. So then everything else falls into place, whether it's endurance or range or sound or power or whatever, because you're not having to work as hard because things are just coming out easier. Do you feel like it works like that for you?
Well, yeah, I feel like my whole body is a lot more relaxed when I play pedal tones than anything else. But my embouchure actually is working pretty hard, because I used to play with, like I say, a pretty loose embouchure, and I even developed air pockets, so I look like air pockets all around, and that caused me to sound weak, and it caused the muscles to not really firm up enough. So um, when I started playing the pedals correctly, I found that this lower lip area would firm up a lot.
Oh, okay.
And I wasn't trying to firm the corners per se, but they did, because when this is firm, your corners will firm. But I've always had a fairly decent overbite, not huge, but enough that I needed to bring the lower jaw forward when I played, and no one ever taught me to do that. The band director I studied with from sixth grade through high school was a great teacher for me, but he never encouraged me to bring the jaw forward. I don't think he ever knew what was going on mechanically about the embouchure that way. But I held the horn down like a clarinet. The mouthpiece was about, I'd say, 3/4 on the top lip and 1/4 on the bottom lip. And then this air pocket thing developed, because as I was playing louder and higher, just kind of came in whether I wanted it to or not. And I had a lot of teachers say, get that bell up, get the horn more straight out. And I could do it, but I couldn't make a sound. And so when I started playing the pedals at first, not doing them correctly, I was holding the horn downward angle about 45 degrees and playing way too much top lip. I could let it all go loose here, and the pedal tones would come out, but they were, like I say, this kind of loose flapping,
Right.
and not really a bass trombone sound. They were, and I couldn't play a low B second valve or B flat first valve and so on going lower. And but after I learned to play them correctly, it took a while, but within a month, the horn had moved up a good 30 degrees.
Wow.
And I wouldn't even try, I wouldn't even think about it. And it's because to get the pedal tones to sound like I wanted them to, by messing around, just trial and error, eventually this somehow got real firm, as though I'm pushing it out. And my lower jaw came forward a little bit and lined my teeth up. The horn came more straight out. I never played perfectly straight out, but it's pretty, slight angle down. But but it used to be like that. Now it's like that,
Yeah.
Uh, and the reason the horn came up is because the jaw came forward, this got firmer, and then it worked. So then to play like low Clark studies, starting on pedal C and going down with regular fingerings, I can do that. And I remember freaking out when I heard Claude Gordon play Clark studies in about 5 octaves and go down to popped out sound like a euphonium or a bass or a valve trombone. And so, it helped me find my correct jaw position. And some people are born with a correct jaw position to play the trumpet, but a lot of people aren't. And so pedal tones can really help those people that point way down. Um, it's not going to happen overnight, but I think if you work with a qualified teacher, you'll see good results real soon, enough that you're encouraged every day. You can't wait to practice. So, I used to, in high school and college, well, especially in college, I practiced maybe 4 hours a day, I would say on average, depending on what rehearsals and concerts I had that day. But basically about 4 hours a day, and I've probably spent hour and a half a day on the pedal tone exercises. And then eventually you get to where you can play arpeggios down to the pedals and back up, and then down to, it just keeps expanding to where you can supposedly, Claude writes it in one big phrase, although you need air. So sometimes you have to break that phrase, but you can go from, say, high C down to double pedal C and on up to double high C. And you may have to do that over a couple or three breaths, but it's all basically, the same embouchure. And certainly to do 1 octave or even 2 octaves at eighth note speed, you can do it all in one breath. And you should be able to do that without feeling like you have to stop and reset.
Right.
It should all feel continuous. And so, I do feel that everything else is relaxed. I used to kind of squeeze, all that went away. So I felt like this here, and then the corners, which for me, I find people with overbites, when they bring the jaw forward, it'll look like they're frowning. You get a slight frown. You're not trying to pull the corners down, but by firming this and bringing the lower jaw forward, it just makes a very slight frowny face. And so it's going to be a little different for each person, but that's the way it works for me.
So when you when you looked at that book, had you been exposed to anyone talking about the tongue level ideas and the K-tongue modified stuff before with those?
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, but a lot of that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me at the time because when you talk about tongue positions, um, again, it's different for each person because um, some people are able to flutter tongue, and they can touch the roof of their mouth with the tip of their tongue. They can touch up there with no problem. But there's others that there's a little frenulum underneath the tongue. And when babies are born nowadays, I say nowadays, like the last 50 years or more, as soon as a baby is born and they clean all the mucus out of the mouth and nose, they lift up the tongue and to see if that frenulum is real pronounced. Because if it is, they're going to take a pair of scissors and clip it. Otherwise, you get what they call a tongue tie. And if you look in a mirror to lift your tongue up, you'll see underneath it, there's a little
Yeah.
ridge of skin that ties the tongue to the floor of your mouth. And for some people, that's a very pronounced little web there. And in some cases, it comes forward enough that the tip of the tongue cannot go above their lower teeth. They cannot touch their top teeth, not with the tip of the tongue. It will only go up to about the end of their bottom teeth. And so these are people that articulate, whether they're tonguing on trumpet or speaking, with the flat part of the tongue, about an inch back. And people can speak very well that way. And I know a lot of trumpet players that play well that way. But there's a lot of people that have trouble. And the little side story, when I was in elementary school, there was a boy in my class, this little farm town, and everybody, all the kids and the teachers thought he was retarded, or it's not the correct term now, but they all thought he was mentally deficient, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
But he talked like this. You could hardly understand him when he talked. He had a terrible lisp, and it was difficult to understand. And so the teacher that we had, I remember it was third grade, she was a very mean teacher. She was mean to everybody. Her nickname was Lightning Striker. She had a huge temper. She got fired because she broke a kid's jaw.
Oh, wow.
He was
That's
sitting in the front
terrible.
row, and we had the old time desk that you lift up to get your books and stuff
Yeah.
out. And she had a rule: when she's talking, nobody's to lift the desk lid up. And his pencil, he was taking notes. His pencil broke, and he was trying to, without her noticing, lift it up just an inch or two to reach in and grab a pencil. And she saw him do it, and she went up, gave him another uppercut, broke his jaw. Kid passed. We never saw her again. She was fired that day.
Wow, that's crazy. Yeah, that wouldn't happen anymore.
Yeah, but anyway, she was so mean, and she picked on this kid to where we all felt so bad for him. And so she she made a sign. It was a sign with a string around it. And she put it over his neck, and it said, "I'm stupid."
Wow.
Wear that all day long
That's
because
terrible.
that's her way of punishing him for not speaking clearly.
Oh,
The
man.
teachers had trouble with him. This kid could not speak. So he finally gets to high school, freshman year in high school. He sees a teacher who immediately says, "You need to get that tongue tie taken care of. Go see your doctor and have him clip the little web." So he went to the doctor. The doctor said, "Okay, let me numb up your tongue," and he clipped it. Kid came back the next day and talked like everybody else.
Wow, that's amazing.
I mean, he wasn't stupid at all. He just,
Right.
he was the last guy in class to want to talk. If she asked the class a question, he didn't want to talk because he was so
Embarrassed. Yeah.
embarrassed by it. So
Yeah.
uh, really changed his life when he learned how to speak correctly. But there are some people that have, I guess you'd call a slight tongue tie, and they can play the trumpet well. They can speak pretty normally, but they can't flutter tongue. And so if people have what we call a tight frenulum, they may fall into what we call anchor tonguing or dorsal tonguing. That falls very naturally to them, where the tongue is more or less positioned, the tip stays against the lower teeth and your tongue with the flat part. So if I anchor my lower tip against, this is the tongue, not this part of the tip, but like the fingernail against the back of the teeth, lower teeth, and then I can talk like this. Da, 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 da. For me, it doesn't work as well as what I call tip tonguing, but for some people, it's the best way. And
Yeah, for
maybe,
me, when I studied with Claude, the first thing we did was actually change the tonguing because I used to tongue up on the top teeth, and it made a really big difference. But I'd tried it before because I read the I was at a summer camp at University of Pacific up in Stockton, and there were a couple guys that played really well, and they were talking about this, and they said, "Oh, you got to look at this thing in the Clark's characteristic studies." I got it, tried it, kind of like you were talking about with Clark, with the Claude Gordon book. And I was like, I can't make this work. So I put the book in my closet, and then I had a tooth broken off, and I had my embouchure was like the opposite of yours. I probably had like 1/4 top lip and was really super low. And it I could make it work, but I'd get up to a certain point, like about a high C, high D, and things would just cut out and not work. So when this tooth got broken off, I went to Claude's camp, and that's where he listed off his 7 things like you've heard in all these lectures. And then the single tonguing, I was like, there's that single tonguing again. I don't know if I can do that. And through through chance, there's a friend of mine that had taken with Claude. He quit, so it opened up one time slot, and I'd called him on the telephone, and he said, I can fit you in as a student here at this time if you can go. And I'm like, I'm going to make it. And he said, okay, until I see you, just take like, it was like just a chromatic, like from a low C to a C in the middle of the staff, just repeatedly on a dot, 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 then a C sharp. Dot, 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 dot. That's all I did for like a week or two. And then I got to the lesson and was like, I think I'm doing it. And he was like, yeah, and I just keep single tonguing that way. And then for me, he gave me a lot of K tonguing. So I don't know if you work on a lot of K tonguing, but that also like changed my playing in a whole lot, because I think it like changed my single tonguing by doing lots of K tonguing. It helped the I mean I don't know if I don't know if I have a more or less of that frenulum thing you're talking about like there, but I can't stick my tongue out very far. It's like that's about as far as they'll come out of my mouth.
You may or may not. I don't know. I'd have to really, look at it. But
Yeah,
there Armando Gatalla played with anchor tonguing, and there are many great players that use the anchor tonguing, and they sound great. And there's others that use the tip tonguing. You know,
yeah,
uh, Herbert Clark describes in the characteristic studies. My own way of tonguing is rather unique. I place the tip of
yeah,
the tongue on my lower teeth and use the flat part, and it's going to work for some people and not work for some people. And tip
yeah.
tongue works for some people, and not, so find out what you can do. But if you can, you flutter tongue, Jeff?
I can, but if I get up to about above like a C or an E in the staff, it gets like really hard to do that. It's like my tongue just wants to stop. I
Well,
think for like, the Marcel Beach etudes where I think it's got like flutter tongue and a G on top of the staff. It's like I've done that before and worked through that book, and I'm like, man, that's probably one of the hardest things to get myself to do, is going up on that note.
it's hard for me at first too, but then after I actually practiced my flutter tonguing and tried to do scales going higher, and I got to where I could flutter my entire range, low to high.
Really? Wow.
And sometimes I would ask somebody, "Do you hear the flutter when I play my highest note?" And they say no, but I could hear it in my head, like, I could hear it. I know
Yeah.
I was doing it, but it just wasn't coming out the bell very strong. But
Yeah.
there's no one way to tongue, and I, I I know if you go on a lot of these trumpet chat lines, and or even just sitting around the dinner table with friends, and somebody says something about dorsal tonguing, somebody has to attack that, and then somebody else has to defend it, and then, there's nothing that'll cause more arguments than how to position your tongue when you single tongue.
Oh, I
So
know. And you're on the trumpet things, and I've seen you respond, and I respond. I try to lay low back in the background sometimes because I don't want to get in the middle of some kind of like argument between people.
but I find that people that can flutter tongue will find that tip tonguing usually works the best. So flutter tonguing is touching, above your top teeth.
Yeah.
Body's trying to tell you that's the fastest, easiest tongue stroke, because it's not double tongue, it's not triple tongue, it's single tongue, just uncontrollably fast. So I do exercises like from the Arbin, where you flutter and then single tongue back and forth. Alternate back and forth, and you'll find that your single tongue will mimic the position and motion of the flutter, and the speed usually comes real quickly. I mean, within a few days of exercise like that, you can push the speed and increase at 30, 40, 50 beats a minute. Um, so the main thing is to get it done.
Yeah. Well, I know one of the other things that was unique with studying with Claude was, just like systematically working through material, whether it was Centricom or other books. And I think you've talked at least a little bit with, I got the student that, David Birdie, that wrote that, like the Aaron Harris, where he went through and like, like restructured it and fixed some stuff in it. I'm sure you know that book, the, that's a great book, and I think a lot of people don't practice that kind of material where you play through every single key, and master playing. That's one of the things I remember when I was studying with Claude. I didn't know all my scales. I could probably play up to like E major and like A flat, but when it got beyond maybe like four sharps, it I was just kind of stumbling around. And and my teacher would always say, my band director and my private teacher before that would always say, you need to work on your scales. You need to work on your scales. And I was like, oh, okay. But they never got super specific at it. Where with Claude, he was like, okay, you're gonna like do Clark's technical studies, and we're gonna play in every single key. And then we're like, oh, we're doing these etudes, and you're playing in like C sharp major. And I was like, okay, I'll just do what you're telling me to do. And then after a while, my band director was like, you know your scales. And I was like, oh yeah, I guess so. Because I was forced to do it. And then I think that's one of the things that was pretty cool, because then it's like every key is just as familiar as the other one. And it's fun to like master that kind of stuff. And I like books like the Aaron Harris book and the Walter Smith top tones, and where it like makes you have to, it's like doing like a musical puzzle.
Yeah.
It's fun stuff. Well, what's next for you? Are you going to ITG next year?
I hope to. Yeah, it's going to
Yeah.
be in LA area.
Yeah, I'm planning on being there.
So yeah, I'll try to go. I try to go every year.
Yeah.
Funny thing about pedal tones, so I started to mention this to you at ITG in Minneapolis, but it got busy at your booth there. We didn't finish it, but Claude Gordon learned how to play pedal tones from his teacher, Louis Maggio. And Maggio learned them from Rafael Mendez.
Yeah,
And
you were saying that.
it all goes back to um, in the 1930s, he came to the U.S. in the 1920s, mid 1920s, and moved to L.A. hoping to become a trumpet player, but he found out he couldn't get any work because it was all union work. And he ran out of money pretty fast, so he heard that they were hiring a lot of Mexicans in the coal factories and the auto factories up in Michigan. So he moved to Michigan and got a job in Flint, Michigan, in shoveling coal in a steel mill. And he had to sell his horn because he needed a heavy overcoat in the winter. He had no idea it was going to be that cold there, so he sold the instrument. Well, after a few months, he got a job working in a Buick auto factory, just working on the assembly line. And because he didn't own a trumpet, the only way he could kind of keep his lip up was to go to a local music store in Detroit and test some of the trumpets they had at this big store. So he'd go there and he'd just be practicing, really, but he'd tell the owner, I'm trying out this trumpet, I might buy it. Anyways, one day, a famous band leader named Russ Morgan walks in, and he hears this young Mexican kid over there, playing away like crazy. And he went over and talked to him. He said, "Is that your trumpet?" He says, Raphael said, "No, I can play it, but I can't buy it." And he said, "Well, I need a first trumpet in the Fox Theater Orchestra, which he was conducting. Theater orchestras back then would play for silent movies, and then sometimes in between shows they would play short concerts on stage. Otherwise, they were in the pit. And he said, I need a first trumpet. If I buy you that trumpet and pay you $150 a week, will you come and play in my band? And Raphael was making less than half of that in the Buick factory. So immediately he jumped at it and said, sure. So he was playing in this pit orchestra. And the second trumpet player is Louis Maggio. And Maggio was about a little over 20 years older than Raphael, about 25 years older. But they became good friends. And Maggio was known as being a really fine teacher, but he was playing second trumpet. They became friends. Well, after they played in that orchestra for about 10 years, And one night there was a tardy musician came in the pit and the swinging door, and he comes barreling through there because he was late, and the door swung and hit Raphael's bell, which then busted out, cracked a tooth, tore up his lip, was bleeding, and he managed to finish the show somehow. But it got infected. And back then they didn't have the antibiotics, so he said his top lip swelled up. He said about the size of a golf ball.
Oh man.
It got infected, and he
Yeah.
went to different doctors, and they didn't have antibiotics back then. So he said all the doctors told him there's nothing we can do. You have to just let it heal on its own. It'll probably take months. And Rafael became impatient, so he went to a doctor in Tijuana, Mexico. And this doctor said, well, this isn't normally what we would do, but because you're a trumpet player and you're in a hurry, I can lance the infected lip open and drain the pus. I'll have to sew it back together, and then you have to wait till the stitches heal. He said, okay. So he lanced it open and he squeezed it out. And then he said before he sewed it together, he cauterized the hole with what Mendez called a soldering iron, but it was some kind of tool they used to cauterize cuts.
Yeah.
Excuse me. And so he said, well, let me show you what I did. And he put a mirror in front of me, and Raphael said the hole right there was big enough he could put a cigarette in it.
Whoa, that's not good.
Then he stitched it all together. Well, it filled in with scar tissue, and a couple months later, Raphael's trying to play again. He can't make a sound. The scar tissue won't vibrate. So this goes on for a long time. Well, he's got to make a living. By then he's married. He's got a wife to take care of, and he starts getting desperate. So he goes to Louis Maggio and says, I haven't been able to play for months now. Can you teach me how to play? Maggio listened to him for a while. Maggio said, I can't help you. I don't know if he'll ever be able to play again. But he recommended that he go to New York and take a lesson from Max Schlossberg, who was principal in New York Phil and taught at Juilliard. So he took a lesson with Schlossberg, and Schlossberg said, I don't know how to help you. I recommend you go to Boston and take a lesson with Walter Smith, who does all the high note stuff real well on cornet. So he took lessons from Smith, and Smith told him the same thing. So he goes to St. Louis, takes a lesson with Joseph Gustat, who was principal in the St. Louis Symphony, well-known teacher.
Yeah.
Gustat said, I can't help you. And he sent him to Herbert Clark in Long Beach. And so he gets his lesson with Clark, and he can hardly make a sound. And Clark hears him play and says, there's nothing I could do. And I have with me from the Mendez library this copy, Mendez's copy of the characteristic studies by Clark.
Cool.
There's a autograph at the top. I don't know if it's readable, but it says, to Rafael G. Mendez, hoping to someday hear you play the contents of this book. Signed Herbert Clark, and dated March 12, 1930. Where are my glasses? 1938. Now, he had his accident in late 1936. So here it is, a year and a half later, he still can't play.
Yeah.
So Raphael decided that the only thing left to do would be to go back to Mexico and take lessons from his father. So he called his father. Now you have to realize that when Raphael left Mexico at the age of 19, his father did not want him to leave. His father, Maximilian, and I got a picture of him, fell on the floor here. A picture of Raphael's parents, Maximino, his father, and his mother, Irene. And his father wanted him to continue playing in the family orchestra. And he also felt maybe he was too young to go to Los Angeles by himself. But Raphael did it anyways. He borrowed some money from a wealthy landowner there in his hometown, and did it. So now, years later, he's going to call his dad and say, I need your help. I need to come home and take lessons. So his dad immediately, I told you so, He was embarrassed, but he went back to Mexico and took lessons from his father. He said, you taught me how to play from the beginning, and I want you to do it all over again. And so his father, who was a mandolin player, but knew all the instruments a little bit, figured out that what he needed to play was pedal tones because he thought it would loosen up the scar tissue. So he had him playing pedals for, started off a half hour a day and then an hour a day and built it up. And after a month or so, Rafael's playing pretty well. After 2 months, he's playing better than he played before. Not only is technique and all still there, and he had already been composing some of his solos, but now his endurance and strength, even range was more solid. So his father wanted him to stay longer, but after about 3 months, he decided, I got to get back to Detroit. He's got a wife there. He's got to earn a living, get back into one of the theater orchestras. So he makes a stop in LA on the way, or Long Beach, and he plays for Herbert Clark. Now he plays some of his favorite Mendez solos, and Clark is literally on the floor. He can't believe this. Here's a guy a few months ago can't make a sound, and now this guy is coming in playing like the great Rafael Mendez. So anyways, he wrote a letter. Clark wrote a letter. I don't know if you've ever seen it, what it said, but it was on the back of one of Rafael's record albums. There's a quote from Herbert Clark to Edwin Franco Goldman, another famous cornetist and conductor. Yeah. He said, Dearest Ed, have you heard the young Mexican trumpeter Rafael Mendez? Such tone, such velocity. 100 years from now, they will have forgotten about us, but they'll always remember the name Rafael Mendez.
That's cool.
Quite a compliment.
Yeah, that is awesome.
Mendez goes back to the theater orchestras, and he's playing next to Maggio again. And now he's incorporating pedal tones into his warm-up, and Maggio hears this and says, what are you doing? What are those? I've never heard you do those. He said, oh, these are pedal tones. I learned to do them. That's what helped me with my embouchure, to come back. Then Mendez got hired by Rudy Vallée, who had a New York orchestra. So Mendez moved to New York for a couple of years and played with Rudy Vallée's orchestra. During that meantime, about a year after Mendez had his accident, Louis Maggio had an accident. He's walking across the street in the snow. This was in Minneapolis. And he slipped on the ice and he fell. There were the trolley tracks. And he fell and he hit something and it busted up his top lip. So it healed, but it left a lot of scar tissue. He wasn't able to make a sound. So by now, Rafael had moved to California because the Rudy Vallée Orchestra had toured Southern California. And they were always doing radio promotion things, interviews and stuff. And so there was a couple of Spanish-speaking radio stations that invited Rafael to be a guest soloist and speaker there. So they interviewed Rafael and they heard him play. They loved his playing. They liked him and thought he had a good sense of humor, would be a good radio host. So they offered him his own show. They said, do you want to move here? And you can have your own show every day, 2 hours, play whatever music you want, play whatever recordings you want, bring in whatever guests you want, and they're going to pay him really good money. And Rafael had fallen in love with that warm southern climate and the palm trees and all that. And so he decided that he would do that. So, by then, Amor, his wife, had 2 twin sons, Robert and Ralph Jr. So they moved to LA and they lived there. Well, Maggio knew that Mendez had fixed his chops through these pedal tones. So he tracked him down, called him up and said, can you teach me how to do all the pedal tone routines that you did? Because I can't play. And he said, yeah, but it could take months. You'll have to move here for a while and take a lesson, every week or whatever. And Maggio did that. And after a few months, Maggio was playing well again, but he decided to stay in Los Angeles and become a teacher because he's always made most of his money teaching. So he moved there and made a living pretty much teaching the pedal tone method that he learned from Rafael. And even Rafael's own sons were taking lessons from Maggio because Rafael was on the road all the time. And, excuse me, couldn't give him weekly lessons. So Maggio became pretty well known for teaching the pedal tones. And in the Mendez library is a very large poster, probably 5 foot across, it was on Maggio's 75th birthday. And it was a birthday party celebration that they had, and it had a lot of Maggio's better students there. And then Rafael was there as the guest speaker and a close friend. So Mendez is in the picture right next to Maggio. And then Claude Gordon, who looks quite young at the time, is in that photo. Johan Racy, who's on crutches, of course, later.
That's interesting because there's that's not the same picture that's in the Maggio book, is it?
No,
Because Claude Gordon is not in that picture. Rafael Mendez and Johan Racy and some others are, but
yeah.
I got to see that picture in your library because that'd be pretty cool to see.
And Johan Racy was on crutches and later went to a wheelchair because of polio. But Spalding was in the picture, all the wrote pedal tone books. So Maggio became well known for Carlton Macbeth is in that picture too, who wrote the so-called Maggio method
Right.
based on his teachings. And then
Claude never, just as a side note, Claude never thought that I'm wondering about this. Claude said that Maggio made everyone promise that they wouldn't like show their routines to other people. And so when once he was talking about the Maggio book, Claude was kind of annoyed and he said, well, the Maggio book really didn't, that guy Carlton Beth didn't take that long and he didn't have everything in there like it could have been. And he was a little bit annoyed by it. But he was like, okay, whatever. But Claude's Maggio routines were supposedly stored at his son Stephen's house. Stephen died, and his wife Stephen and Nadia were two piano duoists that toured around, and it just disappeared. I tried calling and seeing like where'd the things go, and I probably threw them away or something. But I would have loved to have seen what Maggio actually wrote down because that'd be kind of interesting.
yeah, well, of course, Spalding was influenced by the early bodybuilding books that said, work the heavy weights every other day. So his routine is play these pedal tone exercises every other day only. And then Macbeth's book that had the so-called Maggio exercises, I wonder how much of that is Macbeth and how much of that is Maggio, I don't know. But the Claude Gordon book is really quite different exercises from any of the others that I've seen.
Well, and I
And
think what it also does is that's unique is it puts together other material. So it's not just Claude's book. It's like, okay, here get St. Jacome and Clark's characteristic stays and Smith and Cullen and there's like
right,
so many different there's so many books to work through in your life. It'll take forever to get through them. So it's cool to know how to like work through them.
well, yeah, and you can't neglect the technique and other things just because you're working. If you work an hour on the pedal tone book, some people say, okay, I did my work for the day, but no, there's still these other things that we need to do each day. So yeah, Claude was a lot more practical and smart.
So
But
that was really interesting. I had never heard that about. I didn't know that Maggio and Mendez played together like that. And
yeah,
I did. That is like really pretty interesting.
there's
That's
an article about what I'm talking about in the 1979 ITG journal. And H.M. Lewis, trumpet player, did a phone interview with Mendez. And one of the questions was, how did you learn to, or no, he said H.M. Lewis made a comment about, oh yeah, and it was Maggio that helped you get your chops back after the accident. And Mendez really set him straight. He says, no, no. He said, Maggio learned the pedal tones from me, not me from him. And he
That's
goes on.
really interesting.
Maggio first heard me play them as my warm up and so forth in the pit orchestra, and he inquired about them. But later, after Maggio had his own accident, did he actually go and learn the whole routine? And then Maggio, of course, made it famous, and Claude took it to another level, I think.
Yeah.
So who's really the originator? I don't know. Maximino, I guess.
Well, they're pedals in the Clark's elementary studies book, but there's no explanation of them. I remember when, I don't know if you knew this guy, but before Claude, I took 6 years with a guy named Charles Brady. Did you
Yeah,
ever run it? You
yeah.
remember
I
him?
didn't know him personally, but I know who he is. Yeah.
Yeah, he was a fantastic trumpet player. I tell people that it's like I literally never heard the guy play out of tune or crack a note ever. It's like, but he didn't tell me how to play the trumpet, but it was like, I was like, okay, it's got to be that good. So I'm like, I got to try to get it to be like him. But, where's I going with this? So anyway, I got sidetracked on what I was thinking, but I just think that the working on these sorts of exercises can like change your playing in like ways that we're talking about, make you play so much easier. And
Yeah. Well, I think Mendez did it to loosen up the scar tissue, and that's what worked for Maggio too. But and for others, maybe it works in different ways. But for me, it was only because I heard what they're supposed to sound like, not just low, but a real bass trombone type sound. That through experimentation, I managed to bring the jaw forward and do something, and it worked. Had I not seen Ed Lenishek do it, would I have salvaged my career? Well, hopefully, I would have found somebody later on that knew how to play pedals and would have taught me and all that. But anyways, they may work differently for different people, because I know people that play with that already have a good dental occlusion. They tend to think more about firming the corners and just letting the center of the lips be loose. Whereas for people that have to bring the jaw forward, it's more a matter of when the jaw comes out of the hinge back here, the temporomandibular joint, it comes forward, then the muscles, your masseter muscles that are your chewing muscles, and the muscles that come straight down from the corners, those are the sets of muscles that hold the jaw in position because it's a floating jaw when it comes out of that hinge. Now that, it takes a lot of firmness here and here. That's why you see a slight frown with people that bring the jaw forward, and the bell usually comes up. So people that have an overbite, a significant overbite, quarter inch or maybe more, they're going to need to bring the jaw forward. I can pretty much guarantee that. If they leave it down, they might be able to play, but they're always going to suffer for endurance problems and maybe range problems. And I remember when I would finish practicing when I was in high school, I'd play a long etude or something, take the horn off my face. The top lip had a big old red ring on it, and the bottom lip didn't look like anything, no nothing. But and I remember having heard someone in a clinic. So, it was one of the guys in the North Texas 1 O'Clock Lab Band. The 1 O'Clock Band was touring, and they played Little Town, Nebraska. I went to hear the concert, and afterwards, the trumpet section gave a short clinic. People asked questions, and one person said, "When you get tired, is it your top lip or your bottom lip that feels beat up?" And there were 5 trumpets in there. Every one of them said the bottom lip. And I thought that was the strangest answer because my top lip always felt like it was hit with a hammer. The bottom lip, I never noticed anything. And I thought, wow, how can that be? And I did notice when I saw the Stan Kenton band play, and after they'd been playing for an hour and a half or so, between tunes, the Stan Kenton was talking to the audience. The band is putting their next chart on the music stands, and the trumpet players are back there doing this, massaging that lower lip. And that kind of reconfirmed to me, yeah, it's their lower lip that's getting beat up. How come it's my top lip? But after I learned to play the Claude Gordon and I'm firming that up, bringing the horn up, it's always the bottom lip. Top lip may feel it some, but the bottom lip takes the brunt of the force. And when that happens, your top lip is the one that vibrates.
Right.
The low register, both lips, they've done this with fiber optic cameras up the lead pipe and glass mouthpieces with high speed cameras. And in the low range, it looks like both lips are vibrating kind of equally. But when you get in the bottom line E up, all you see is the top lip moving.
That's interesting.
I noticed that a lot of the old time teachers used to refer to the top lip as the tone lip. You
Huh.
know, if you take a pencil, buzz your lips, and you take a pencil and just touch your top lip, you hardly touch it and you'll kill the buzz. There's hardly any buzz. But you can press here on the red of the lower lip even hard. It may change the pitch a little bit, but it won't stop the buzz. It'll keep on buzzing. So you can play, your bottom lip can be bleeding. It's so beat up, and you'll still sound great.
Right.
Which
I know. I mean, it wasn't like I started with Claude in the middle of high school and changed these things. But I remember I've never experienced having my top lip being beat up. I mean, I'd already made it through like about 2 years of studying with Claude, but if I was playing salsa band gigs or playing lead or something, the only place I'd feel it is like where my mouthpiece rim, like I play with my mouthpiece pretty high on my top lip, and where it just kind of sits in the red, I get almost like a little dry spot on my lip from it rubbing. And but that could be like it would get, I mean, this is kind of gross, but it would almost be like a dry piece of skin. I'd just pull it off, and it would sometimes was a stupid idea and be like raw, but I could
yeah,
still play the trumpet fine because
sure.
my top lip was working, you know?
And I didn't talk to Claude Gordon about this because at the time I wasn't really in a position to argue with him or anything because I was a young teacher. But when I look at this picture of his embouchure, his corners are frowning. So I think he's bringing his jaw forward and doing that. But yet inside, he has a diagram that shows how the pucker should be, and he talks about the round circle with all the arrows all around it pointing inward, and that's not what I think he's doing, and that's
No,
not.
I mean that's when I remember talking to him about this. I think that's because when I came to him, I was playing the pedal tones wrong. I was like trying to I'd gotten the Maggio book, and I saw that picture of the monkey that was in there where he was kind of going like, and I went and I was doing my pedals like that, and Claude's like, "What are you doing? That's not the way to do this. Or do it like this." And I was like, and it was totally different, kind of like what you're saying, because I didn't understand how to do them right.
You went to
And,
the
and
photo. I don't
yeah, and
agree.
I showed him that photo. I was like, "What?" And he was like, "I was like, isn't that the same as your diagram that you're saying?" And he told me, he was like, "Man, it might have been in a pedagogy class that I went through with him." He was like, "Man, I wish I wouldn't have put that in the book because so many people like misunderstood it." Because he was saying I wasn't talking about the aperture of their lips or tightening your lips or like that. I think his point was to try to say to not smile or stretch your lips back, and that it's going to have a slight feeling of doing that, but it's not like you're trying to control the opening of your lip or your aperture or something, you know?
I just
But,
let the top lip be relaxed. Just let it sit there and vibrate. You don't need to.
right,
If I do the arrows from all directions, it pinches the sound.
right. Yeah. And he's got in his brass swing is no harder than deep breathing book, he's got a diagram where he actually does show what you're talking about. He was saying some people look like they're frowning. He was like basically saying, don't smile. And so he's like, don't do that. And he's like, some people look like they're frowning, which he was saying that's okay. He's got a diagram where some people look like their face is going like that. He was like, that's okay too. So he was it kind of goes along with what you're talking about. But I think with a lot of this stuff, when you write like kind of like you probably know this quote that's like in the end of the Arbin book where he's talking about sometimes writing too much will cause more confusion, you know? It's like like teaching's an art form, and having it passed from one person to another is communicates much better than sometimes reading about it, you know?
Well, in my thinking, uh, the top lip just sits there. You put the mouthpiece on it. The bottom lip does pretty much all the puckering. And if you're someone that needs to bring the jaw forward, you may not even realize you're doing it because it's to move the lower jaw an eighth of an inch or a quarter inch. You won't hardly even feel it, but you'll see the frown in the corners. I'm not trying to pull them down, but when you firm up I can't remember what the names of the muscles are that come straight down from the corners. Those and the masseter muscles or chewing muscles, those support that lower jaw.
Yeah.
That so you have fixed jaw players, you have floating jaw players, and both of them are fine. The fixed jaw players tend to think more about the corners, and they don't really worry about doing anything else. They think corners, and they think this can remain loose. Fine, and I still think this should remain loose, but the bottom chin area needs to be firm if you're bringing the jaw forward. So for each person, it's a little different, but the
Yeah.
main thing is play the pedal tones and get that trombone-like sound on the pedals. You can play them just as loud and just as clear as a trombone would on the same pitches, and then you'd be able to do fast chromatics like Clark studies with regular fingerings, and they should pop in like you can really hear them pop,
Yeah.
not just the gliss. And when you're getting that sound, I don't care if you're playing it out with your ear, that's your best way.
Yeah. Yeah. It's cool stuff. I mean, that's so I'm looking forward to getting to see you and hang out again at ITG and talk even more in person. It'll be fun.
I hope to see you there, ITG.
Yeah, I mean, this has been really interesting. I think for me, this that the thing that I never knew before was like what you were talking about with Maggio and Rafael Mendez and all of that, you know?
Yeah, I mean,
Oh, I know where now I just got my train of thought back. I know why I mentioned Charles Brady. Because when I was younger and I was studying with Charles Brady, he took me through Clark's elementary studies, and we got to the end of the book, and it has like a one-page etude, and it's got like a three-octave chromatic from a low G to high G, and then it's got this chromatic scale or chromatic fingerings from double C to double pedal C, and I turned to Mr. Brady and said, "Wow, can you do that?" And he was like, no, and I was like, "Why not?" Show me. And he was like, "Well, I can play up to a G," and he played a great sounding high G. And I was like, "What about these other notes?" And he didn't really talk about them. And I remember seeing him in that book, and I was like, "What is this?" Because they were written like in bass clef and stuff. And I was like, "I don't really read bass clef. How can the trumpet do that?" And it wasn't until later when I went to Claude and I was like, "Oh, I remember seeing that in that other book," and I saw the Maggio book, but it wasn't until like we're talking about someone told me how to put it all together and like do it the right way that because I mean the pedals to me were just a mystery until someone showed me what to do with them. It's I find it really interesting that like the similarity with what I was saying where you can get a book, try it, and it doesn't do anything because maybe you don't know what to do with it, you know. And so it's interesting to actually talk to the person that came up with these ideas, you know?
well, Mendez, maybe he should have written a pedal tone book, but he didn't write any books. I mentioned earlier that book, the Prelude to Brass Playing.
Yeah,
His contract with Carl Fisher, he was to write a textbook on brass playing, and he wasn't that good with the English language and didn't consider himself a good enough writer. He did not ever even attempt to write a book, but he was playing a concert in Calgary, and the trumpet teacher at the University of Calgary picked him up at the airport and drove him around for the couple of days he was there. And then the day he was flying back to LA, he picked him up and they had breakfast together, and then they took him to the airport. And this fellow's name, oh gosh, let me think of his name. Um, he'll come to me in a second. But anyways, this trumpet guy, um, when they were having breakfast, hands Mendez a manuscript to a book. It was all typed up. And Mendez said, well, what's this? He said, well, I wrote this book called Prelude to Brass Playing. And I tried to get it published. And he had sent copies of it to 2 or 3 publishers, and they all turned it down. And the reason he said they turned it down is because no one heard of this guy. So he said, I'm not a big enough name to sell books, and so they wouldn't publish it. So I've given up, but I thought I'd give a copy to you. So Mendez said, well, thank you. They go to the airport. He gets on his flight. On the way home, Mendez is reading his book. He read the whole thing. When he got back, he called the guy and said, I really like your book. A lot of your ideas are very similar to mine. And I have this contract with Carl Fisher to publish a textbook, and I don't think I'm ever going to get around to doing it. What if we publish it together, and we'll put both our names on it, and I'll split the royalties with you? And this guy said, wow, that would be fantastic. He said, I'd like to add just a few little things and supplement, here and there, but we'll do that. And so they agreed to it verbally. He sends it to Carl Fisher. They put it out, and it comes out as a book. I bought it when it was first out when I was in high school.
Yeah, I'll show you. Keep talking. I'm going to grab mine because I have it. I have it here. Here's, where is it?
Do you have the one ITG re-released, or do you have the?
No, I have an old one that is, here it is.
Yeah, that's what I got. That's the old brown cover that came out. What's the copyright on that?
The copyright.
67, I think.
Let's see, that'd be 61.
61. Wow.
Yeah, it says, yeah, MCM LX1, that'd be 61.
Yeah. Okay, well, anyways, yeah, that book came out and it didn't have the other guy's name on it.
Yeah, this doesn't have the other guy's name. I got it from someone that gave it to me that's local, that their family member created that blue juice valve oil. And there was a bunch of books that they were trying to just give away, and they said, oh, hey, he plays trumpet, let's just give him that. And I was like, whoa, that's cool, I like that.
Well, this guy's name was Edward Gibney, Gibney. Came to me finally. And after we formed the Mendez Library, maybe a year after that was open, I get a letter from Ed Gibney in Calgary. By this time he had retired and was getting older, but he sent me a 3-page type letter that told the story I just told you about, how he gave the book to Rafael, and supposed to have both their names on it. And when it was published, it only had the name Rafael. And from all the details that he gave me, I could tell this was a true story. No one could make this up. And well, anyways, years go by, and ITG had a committee, maybe they still do, called the Reprints Committee. And the function of this committee was to take old books, or maybe even music that's been out of print, that ITG members think are important and they want to keep it going. They would, ITG would contact the publisher and say, we would like to give this out as a freebie to all of our members, and we will buy them from you for, $3 a book or something, and a little over their cost of printing them, and then hopefully you'll print more and you can keep it on the market for the general public. And the publisher's going to do it. Why not? We'll print more and we're going to make money right off the bat, and so. But then I got a call one day from the president of Carl Fisher. I don't remember his name. This is probably 20 some years ago, but this man called me and he told me that that some people, or Mike Sachs, who was on this commissions committee, reprint committee, I should say, knew knew this guy, this president, because Mike had published quite a few books with Carl Fisher, and so he said, "You need to contact David Hickman because he knows the story about this Mendez book that Mendez didn't write it, and it should have two names on it." So this guy called me and wanted to know the story. I told him, and he said, "Yeah, we can do that. We'll put Ed Gibney's name on there." So, anyways, a few months go by, and then I get in the mail from Carl Fisher a box, and it had about a dozen of these published copies, the reprint, which still have one or two in the Mendez library, and the others I kept for myself or gave away. But on the cover, it says Prelude to Brass Playing, Rafael Mendez. But when you open it up, there's an inside cover, which yours was signed, but it said Prelude to Brass Playing by Rafael Mendez, and it said with Edward Gibney, which kind of pissed me off because when it says with somebody, that usually means that he's being interviewed. Like if someone dictates a book and somebody writes it down, the last memoirs of a famous person,
Yeah,
with so the other person's really just dictating it and typing it up, editing the book. But so they never did give him his proper credit. But anyways, I mailed some copies of that book that I got from ITG to Ed Gibney, to that same address that he had sent me the letter. And about a month later, I got a letter from Gibney's daughter saying that he had just passed away, that Gibney had gone into a hospital and was not going to get out. He was going to die. He was on his deathbed. But in the mail from me, she got some copies of that book, and she took them in to him, opened it up, and there was his name on that book with right next to Mendez. And it said he was really happy about it. And so she said he died a happy man, saying his name there with Raphael. But I still don't think he got his due credit, although Mendez always did send him a royalty check for half the
that's
royalty.
nice. That's nice, man. That's a cool part of the story too. I mean, um, I really appreciate getting to talk with you and everything. My goal with all this stuff is to try to keep the legacy of all the Claude Gordon and the Herbert L. Clark stuff alive, so people see the value of it. I know you've done this with Rafael Mendez and all the things we've been talking about. And I'd like to continue talking about that topic too. Probably more privately, but I think that I think our history with the trumpet playing and all the method books and all this stuff needs to be preserved and understood so that people don't just forget about it. Because I look at it as there was once a quote, I think I saw it in like a Charles Cullen brass conference book or program or something they mailed out, where someone asked Claude Gordon about, what's your experience or whatever, because maybe saying, look, you don't have a degree, because he never went to college. And he said, well, I've got 40 years of Arvin's experience, 40 years of St. Jacome, 40 years of Clark. And he looked at it as like, look, I've like delved into all these books to try to get the wisdom from these guys and make it my own so I can like share it. And I think that's where the value of the wisdom and experience of all these people that have come before us is so important, to not just think that we're reinventing something ourselves, because a lot more people are smarter than all of us and have talked about these things long before.
Herbert Clark never went to college. Doc Severinsen never went to college. I mean, you don't have to have degrees to be a great trumpet player,
Right.
great trumpet teacher. So
You just have to practice really well and smart.
figure it out and be able to demonstrate it and communicate it.
Right.
And
No.
also, in my opinion, always believe that there's no one way to play. That you have to look at each student as their own individual. I hate teachers that try to make every student play exactly the way they do it. Use my embouchure, play the same mouthpiece I play. You got to play the same brand of horn I play. You got to, I comb my hair a certain way. You got to comb yours that way. I've studied with teachers that were like that, and man, it can mess you up.
Well, that's one of the things I found interesting, and I totally agree with it. With interviewing Frank Rabbit recently, he was saying that he appreciated Claude. Like at the brass camps, we'd have people that were lead players, orchestral players, people who are on the road with rock bands, and even though Claude Gordon didn't really like rock music, it was all just about playing the trumpet really well. So, and he was really into listening to all different players, like whether it was Maurice Andre or Chicago Symphony, and he wasn't, he didn't have this mindset of like, well, that's a really great trumpet player because they're orchestral or this. He's like appreciated it all, and that's kind of, I mean, I think that's the cool thing about playing music is that there and seeing so many different players out there that there's rooms for people to be an individual, instead of the world would be pretty boring if we all sounded the same,
Yeah.
it's it's cool. I that's why I love teaching people, because it's kind of like if I can show them just how to practice and gain the skills, they can figure out like what kind of music they want to do with it, and if I've like given them enough of the basics to be able to do that, then it's kind of like set them free to go do what they feel led to do. And that's kind of, I think that's kind of why Claude was unique with stuff too, is he wasn't teaching someone to be a lead player or whatever kind of player, is just teaching you to play the trumpet. And I mean, it sounds like that's what you're about too, is showing people how to improve in all their different parts of their playing.
Yeah. Well, I think of the great cornetist Jules Levy, who was Herbert Clark's idol when Clark was a boy. And Jules Levy learned to play on his own. As a boy, he was infatuated with music, and he lived right across the street, across an alley from a music theater that played like vaudeville stuff in England every night. And he would go to bed, but he'd sneak out his window and go over to this place. And the musician saw this kid hanging out. He was like 6, 7 years old, and he he was infatuated with the cornet. So they said, "Well, come over here and you can turn pages for me." Well, he didn't know how to read music, but whenever the cornet player would kind of wink at him, he would turn a page. And supposedly, Levy is watching this cornet player play all the time, and he's watching the fingerings for certain notes that he would play, and did this for months. And he was saving up his money because he wanted to buy a cornet, and he managed to save enough money to buy a good used cornet. And he told his dad, he said, "I got enough money, I want to go buy a cornet." And his dad said, "No, you need a new pair of boots. You're going to spend money on boots." So they bought some boots, but he had enough money to buy a mouthpiece. So Levy was playing on this mouthpiece like for hours every day, and got developed some pretty good chops and a pretty good ear. And because he'd seen the guy play and knew what fingerings went with what notes on what tunes, one day between shows, he's backstage with the musicians, and he picks up this cornet player's cornet. And the cornet player immediately got kind of mad at him. "Hey, don't touch that." But everybody was egging him on, saying, "No, let him play it, let him play it." And he picked it up, put his mouthpiece in, and started playing. I mean, he was playing the book, he was playing the tune. First time he ever tried to play, because he knew the fingerings and knew how the tunes went, and he had developed pretty good chops. And he became, supposedly in his day, the world's greatest cornetist.
Yeah, he would. The thing that cracks me up about him is he would tell people that I'm the world's
That's
greatest cornetist that will ever live.
world's most conceited cornetist too. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. But I mean, I talked to Claude Gordon used to tell about that, and he said the funny thing was that Clark said it was true. He's like, Clark said that there was never anyone that played as well as Levy.
Yeah, well, the
He-
stories, some of the newspaper reviews of Levy's concerts, they don't just describe it like they do in most reviews, saying it was wonderful, it was perfect playing, it was astounding, things like. They talked about it being godlike and that it was his sounds were from pure heaven.
Yeah, that's pretty wild.
Review said it was the greatest cornet playing on this side of the line, referring to the line between heaven and earth.
Yeah.
And he was known to go to a town to play a concert. And the morning of the concert, if he was warming up, his chops didn't feel like, if he was worried he might miss a note, he'd cancel the concert, postpone it to the next day. They kept talking about he would play, it was flawless concerts that he played on a program. And I've seen printed programs. There might be 3 or 4 solos listed in this concert, like him soloing with his own band. He toured with his own band a lot of time. Um, and he may be listed 4 different times playing a solo, but they say in the reviews, it would say that for each solo that he played, he would play 2 or 3 encores, which were different solos. So he'd play a dozen solos in a concert. And they said they couldn't imagine him making a mistake. That's how good it was.
I
The
would
only,
like, and
the
you
only
have you seen,
recordings we have of Levy are long after he retired.
right, I know. He still sounds great on those.
He
Um,
finally ran out of money and in his retirement, about 10 years after he retired, and people said, now they're doing recordings, on this Edison machine. You need to make some recordings. So he tried to get his chops back, and he recorded a handful of solos. And I have, on tape some of those early gramophone things. And the playing is still quite good, but there are missed notes. And it's just, of course, I think about, I've been retired and haven't been playing for 4 years. If I came back and tried to play a recording, yeah, probably missed a few notes. Well, uh, he was not playing for 10 years.
yeah.
So it's hard to compare what we can hear of him with how he really played.
Well, would be interesting to investigate. Maybe, if someone's already done this is like David Birdie did this kind of companion book to go along with Saint Jacome, and he tracked down a lot of the history with it. And I didn't really know this, you might have, that Saint Jacome actually moved to England. He left Paris, moved to England, and was a tester for the Besson Company when
Right.
Martha Besson and all the different things of the Besson Company had problems. And so I'm wondering, what would the possible connection likely have been between maybe Saint Jacome and Jules Levy? Did they ever meet each other, or between the Besson Company? Because I mean, to think about it is like, man, Saint Jacome might have been testing out your antique Besson cornet. If you find like a really old one, he might have been the guy checking it out before it went out of the factory.
Yeah, I don't know what a lot of the interactions were between those two and others, but yeah, I know when they had a World's Fair out in New York, I think it was, they had a band and they wanted to feature some of the world's greatest cornet solos. So they brought in Levy, and then they had who was the no, not Macintosh. Oh gosh, one of the really great American cornetists played with Sousa band. Um, Not sure exactly who it is, but anyways, they were considered to be the 2 greatest cornet soloists. This is before Clark was a big name, and the two met at there in New York at a restaurant, and Levy walked over to the other guy and said, "Well," or no, that man walked over to Levy, who was sitting there eating, and he said, "Well, I see the 2 kings are here." And Levy looked up at him and, without saying hello, or supposedly said, "There's only one king, and it is I." Supposedly they never got along after that. wonder why.
That's funny.
Yeah,
Well, this has been really lots of fun, and I hope we get to do it again and hang out at ITG next year. I'm definitely going, and so are quite a few other people that I know that we'll all get to meet you and hang out with you too. So this has been really fun, and I'm glad I got to share the things that you with other people. I'm going to post this up on YouTube later. Get to share this with other people, so it's been exciting. So thanks for all your time. This has been a treasure.
thank you, Jeff, and thanks for doing all the interviews and books and teaching that you're doing too. It's really important.
Thanks. Well,
Thank you.
I will talk to you again soon, and I'll let you know when I post this.